G'day, Ben from Duck Plain Chicken here with a new build series. This time we're delving into the Aura Battler Dunbine universe, and I'll be building Bandai's 1/550th scale Aura Ship Zelerna. This kit was originally developed in 1983, I believe, and this is a repop of this kit. So given that it's an 80s style kit, it's going to be pretty rough around the edges. I've chosen this one to do. There are lots of kits, especially the mechs from the series, but I chose this because this vehicle, the ship, is so bonkers. I love it. You know, it's just really weird looking, and I think it'll be a lot of fun to build this up. Haven't decided if I'm going to sort of light it or anything yet, but we'll wait and see once I sort of get it assembled. So, having a look at what's in the box. I'll go through the instructions in a minute. Now, the sprues do come individually bagged. I've just taken them out so that it makes it a bit easier. All this noise. So we get one sprue that's in this sort of red colour. Now the detail is sort of reasonable. You do get a couple of figures in it, so you get like 2 Dunbine figures and also 2 what looks like the Darnarossi, I think it is Darnarossi. So I mean they look pretty basic in their stance, so I don't know if we can do anything to make their stances look a bit more exciting. But you can see, you know, there's reasonable detail. You get the hand railing, which is quite, I mean, it's probably not really to scale, it's probably a bit thick, but it doesn't look too bad. Most of the parts, most of the sub-assemblies in this kit are sort of 2 halves that are stuck together, so there's going to be a lot of fixing up the seams. So that's the marine sprue, and then we get a couple of these light green sprues. So we get the main body of the craft, the base of it, a few parts from the legs, and then we have this second one, which is sort of more details on the body, and some of the other sort of looks like engine detail and what have you. So there's not a lot in the kit, like it's, you know, 3 sprues. There's no decals in this kit. And if we have a look at the instructions, these pretty typical of a 1980s sort of style instructions. We get some illustrations, a little bit of information about the craft itself. When we look at the instructions, we've got the call outs for the sprues that you get. We start off by looking at the, what do they call that, converter, I think it is. The crane, side decks, the gun replacements. Get the engine assembly, the wings. Now the wings are interesting in the fact that they have, let me bring this up to show you a bit better. So they have sort of 2 modes where it's landed, and so you can see the sort of feet, I guess you could call it, splayed out. And then you have flight mode where they're all sort of closed up. Now you have sort of 2 options. You can do it in the landed mode or you can do it in the flight mode. I haven't determined whether that's actually permanent, whether you sort of glue them in or not, or whether you can swap them out. So we'll have a look at that. I'm sure we'll be able to modify something, you know, even with magnets or something, that we can swap out the different parts. We've got the main sort of body assembly. What have we got here? Attaching the legs. So the legs are articulated. So you can sort of see they're made up of a number of parts, but you do get the sort of hinge mechanism in there. We have the engine, what's that, engine wings. We have the installation of all the sort of bits and pieces on the body. We have the handrails, We're sort of finishing up the details and then the figures. Now they do have a paint call out. It's pretty basic, but they sort of do have a bit of a painting guide. So I haven't sort of looked at the paints yet that I've got to see whether I've got anything sort of close to these. I think the problem colour is probably going to be this green. I'm probably not going to be able to get that sort of close to it, but we'll see. I don't really mind if I go for something that's maybe a little bit more sort of forest green. I do really love this illustration on the box. Now, given it's a 1980s anime, was it 80s or 70s? I'm pretty sure it was early 80s. You know, it was very sort of basic shading and what have you, similar to other anime at that time. But I really like the look of the illustration. If I can sort of replicate that a little bit, I think I'll be happy with that. Now you do have these sort of cockpit areas. Unfortunately they're not clear parts, so I'm not sure how I'm going to sort of deal with that. If I do any lighting, it'll probably be around these sort of details here. Not sure if they're supposed to be lights or windows, but looking at it, I don't know. I don't know if I'll sort of do any lighting at this stage. The other thing that's interesting, and it's sort of really apparent on this illustration, there's, if I remember rightly from the series, there's a craft that hangs off this. Is it the fowl or something? It's sort of like a small craft that, you know, clamps into these two bits here. But that's not included with this kit, which I think is a bit unfortunate. But nonetheless, we'll get cracking and see how we go. So the first step will be for me to obviously remove all the parts and start sort of putting together all those sub-assemblies where it's sort of two halves, so I can start working on the seams. So I've removed all the parts from the sprues and I've sort of started some dry fitting to see how this thing goes together. It is quite a unique sort of craft, and as a result it's quite a unique model. And I should say from the outset, this is not a snap fit model. This is definitely going to need glue and a lot of sort of puttying. Now it is interesting in the fact that they've actually, where a lot of the seams are, they've put in I guess what you would call panel lines, but of course at this scale they're kind of a lot larger than just panel lines. And to me they look really ugly. It just looks like it looks like a seam. So I will be filling all of these, but they've actually done it on a lot of areas in the kit where you've got the two halves. But to give you an example, here's one of the, I don't know what these things are, they're like exhaust ports or something, but on the back there was a sort of panel line that was, you know, made into the pieces so that when you stuck them together. So what I've done is I've used some what's commonly known as sprue goo, which is basically just styrene scraps mixed with Tamiya extra thin cement, and that creates kind of a almost like a styrene cement, a styrene putty. And you can see the one on the right here, this is where the pieces have been glued together, but you can see that deliberate panel line they've created, so that's actually molded into the pieces. Now for me, I'm not a fan, so I am going to continue on using the sprue goo to fill those seams. So just to quickly show you what that looks like, and you can mix it to whatever viscosity you need. This stuff's pretty thin, which means there's a lot more glue compared to the amount of styrene I've added in there. But you literally just sort of feed it into the gap, and it may take a couple of applications, so I'll leave this dry for a good couple of days. It's the one problem with working with this stuff as opposed to, say, to me, a white putty or any of the other sort of putties around. This stuff takes forever to dry properly, so it'll take good sort of 3 or 4 days to cure before it's ready to be sanded. If you sand it before it's properly cured, it will actually sort of peel away and make a bit of a mess. So yeah, that's all right. I'm willing to wait for a few days for it. But all these sort of exhaust ports, you know, they're all sort of two halves. So you've got a bit of seam work to do. You can see the putty I've put in there just because these sort of moulded in panel lines along the halves. Now, I haven't watched the anime for a while, so I'm not sure if that's actually canon or not, but to me, it just looks ugly. It looks like, two halves have been stuck together without seams being dealt with, so that's why I'm filling all of those. Alright, a couple of other things to point out. First of all, with this top section here, there's a railing that goes around it. And it looks like they kind of messed up a bit. I don't know. I think some of these legs were supposed to be longer because there's sort of a divot here, 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 and here. And it looks like the posts on this railing should have been longer for those ones, but they're actually not. Well, the front ones are, but not the back ones. So I might end up just sort of filling those in or something. And there's a gun turret that goes on the back here. But of course I'll have to sort of fill all this with putty and sand it before I worry about that. So the actual construction, you can see I've sort of got the base bit. There's the 4 legs that come off it. And the legs are sort of made up of this articulated arm. And then there's the foot part that goes on. And the feet are 2 parts, so I'm going to I've got to clean these up first. Again, they've got these sort of panel lines down where the seams are, so I've got to get rid of those, and then once I've sort of sanded that down, I'm happy with that. I can glue these and fix that seam, that very obvious seam that goes along the bottom there. Now, this will need a bit of masking just because the actual foot part is sort of a white colour, whereas the arm is green. And these little pegs here sort of slot in underneath, and then there's a little sort of round bit that goes around to sort of tidy it up a bit. So there's 4 of those that go underneath. There's the 2 sort of clips that hang onto the small craft. There's, as far as sort of engines, there's the main one at the back. And you can see, because that's 2 halves, it's always going to be really tricky to get these fins to look right. So what I'm going to end up doing is cutting all that out and recreating those fins with some styrene. So it'll just look a lot tidier than trying to match up these 2 halves properly and trying to deal with the seams and those. Now then there's these 2 of these sort of engine parts that go on the back, and they sort of slot in like so. And again, you've got these fin parts here, which I'm going to cut all that out and then recreate that with styrene sheet. And even for these back exhaust ports, you can sort of see there's a bit of a mess there with the mould. I'm going to cut that out, I reckon, and make a bit of a feature of it and tidy that up. Same with this top one. So there's quite a bit of work. I mean, I expected it, given that it's an older kit. It was always going to be a bit more work. But then there's sort of that. Like I said, it does actually need glue, so it doesn't sort of hold together very well without glue. That sort of bit slides on, and this makes up another part, which is like a pontoon with a couple of, stabilizers on it. And the stabilizers sort of work where they are either splayed out like a foot, okay, so like that. And then they have this little piece that sort of slots in there and attaches to the pontoon. Unfortunately, they only give you enough to determine whether they're either open or closed. You can't have both. I thought if they give some spares, I could sort of swap them out. So you've either got to decide whether it's landed, so it would be like this, or whether it's in flight mode and then they're actually glued together. So I'm going to go with flight mode. So I'm going to end up sort of gluing these together, and then they attach do the pontoon like so, and then they sort of hang down. So that's those things. Probably got the terminology wrong, but that's what I'm calling them. Keep an eye out, there are a lot of ejector pin marks, so these sort of platforms here I've had to sort of sand them flat just because there were some pretty severe ejector pin marks. There are some on the bottom, but thankfully they're hidden by this part here. So if I take this apart and sort of show you some of the other things that are going on. So this being the main sort of body of the ship. So it's just two halves, like so. Now the reason I haven't sort of glued these together is because I think I want to incorporate some lighting. So around these little bits here, I want to sort of drill them out and put in some LEDs, and also these ones here. So I need to do that before I glue them together, just because it's going to be pretty tight, especially for these ones along the edge here. They're sort of going to be, yeah, it's all going to end up pretty tight in there. So I'll do some lighting in there. I think will be nice to just add it a little bit of interest. I will probably do some lighting on the engines as well. So I haven't quite decided how I'm going to do that, but I'm sure it'll just be a matter of using some LEDs and a little bit of diffusion. And because I'm going to have this in flying mode, I will need to make a stand for it. It doesn't come with a stand, so just be aware of that. In a lot of cases, I guess a lot of people would just have it so that it's sort of landed with the feet deployed, but I'm going to have it in flying mode. So there's sort of that part. There is also this piece, which is made up of a number of sub-assemblies. So let's get this bit off first. So we've sort of got this platform here, the top, and in here, these little red pieces, they're like little, they're almost like sort of polycaps, but they're not, they're just styrene, but they're there to hold in a couple of guns. And what the instructions actually tell you to do, if I bring this up, you can see they sort of say put, you know, sort of glue the little polycap thing to the gun and then slot it in when you sandwich all these pieces together. But for me, it was kind of like, nah, I don't want to do that. So what I ended up doing was gluing them in place. I've put some styrene in between the two, and that was because what I ended up having to do was drill them out. So I've used a 1.5mm drill bit, and then if we have a look at the guns, they'll sort of hold in like that. So that way I can paint the guns separately, and they still rotate, you know, there's no problem there. But it just means I don't have to worry about sort of lining all that up when I get the, you know, the rest of this sort of sandwich together. Now this bottom bit, again, it's made up of two halves. Sort of haven't decided whether I'm going to light this rear part here or whether that's going to be an exhaust, but either way I'm going to remake these fins, so I haven't sort of glued it together yet. So I think that's kind of as far as I've got at the moment. Everything else just needs a good cleanup, good sanding, and the kit actually seems to fit reasonably well, but it just, you know, it does need glue, and you do need to deal with a lot of these seams. Okay, I want to just highlight something before I sort of go further into the build. These pieces here, these exhausts or whatever they are, and these ones as well, I have sort of dug up some screenshots from the series, and there are actual panel lines that sort of run down the length of these. So you can see sort of where I've started filling that one, but it runs all the way down the back. And there's also one along the front side here. Now, for me personally, okay, what I've done is not accurate where I've filled those panel lines, but to me they just kind of look weird. and it makes it look like a model kit that's been sort of just stuck together. So I am going to continue in filling these seams, but for those of you who sort of know the series, you'll know that yes, there are actual panel lines, and you can sort of see from the screenshots here that there are the panel lines sort of running along these two halves, I guess, of these pieces. So just wanted to highlight that before I go any further, that yes, I am aware that what I'm doing is not canon, but for me personally, I prefer it if it's a nice clean seam. So that's what I'll be doing. All right, moving on to the lighting. I have drilled some holes. So these are 1mm holes for the front, and these ones I kind of screwed up a bit. They should really be 1.5mm holes, but I don't have any 1.5mm fiber optic on me, so I've gone with 2mm holes. They're probably a little bit too big, but I think at the end of the day it's not going to really matter that much. So I've drilled those holes out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use I was kind of thinking about, do I stick LEDs directly inside here, or do I use fiber optics, multiple fibers hooked up to one LED? And so what I've done is I've ended up using a mix of the two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a LED to a fiber optic for each of these windows, and that way it'll serve two purposes. One, I'll get a really sort of bright light coming out of here, but also it means I can have the fiber optic protruding out while I paint it, and then I can sort of trim it flush once I've finished painting. So let's I'll take you through the process. First of all, what I've done is I've taken some 1mm fiber optic, and this is the plastic stuff that's readily available, and I've dunked the end of it in Tamiya clear orange. X26, and I've let that to dry for a good 24 hours because the way I'm going to attach the LED using UV resin, it will react with the Tamiya paint if you haven't let it sort of dry properly. The reason I've dunked it in orange is because I want the lights to appear orange, but I've got all my LEDs are these 0603 warm white LEDs. So I just tend to find, rather than actually buying specific coloured LEDs, I prefer to just buy white ones, and then I can use the clear paints that I have to give me the colour, the final colour that I want. So these LEDs are pre-wired because I don't have the eyes to pre-wire that. So these are tiny. And what I'll be doing is setting this up on my little stand here so that I can use some UV resin to attach them. So set this up on the clamp, and then I can take some UV resin and literally just attach it to the end there. Just using my old faithful UV resin that comes from AliExpress, readily available. You can get it on eBay and stuff. It is the same stuff that is used in a 3D resin printer. So there's a good lump onto the palette here. Take the LED, dunk it in, be really generous with the resin, and get my UV light ready. So now that's sort of in place, what I'm going to do is just reinforce it a bit more. So I'm taking this whole sort of assembly, dunking it in the UV resin. Doesn't matter if it's not tidy. And then hit that again. Okay, so now if I test that, we should be able to see the orange light coming out the end of the fiber optic. Okay, so you can see it's working pretty well. Now, of course, there'll be light blocking and stuff I need to do down the other end, but that's fine. So the next step that I go through is to do a little bit of light blocking at this stage. Eventually, it's going to be sort of all of these are going to be put into the front here, and I'll fill the whole thing with 2-part epoxy putty. So that should do a bit of light blocking as well. But even at this stage, I can get some of the tulip fabric paint, and then just wrap that around. Doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to be functional. And so basically it's, you know, just a blob like that, and then I'll let that dry for a good sort of 24 hours. So that's sort of the process for making the, I guess, the lights that go in. But here's what I've done on the other side. You can see that I've got them sort of all in place. I've trimmed them almost to the edge, but not quite. This is just so that I don't have to worry about masking them for painting. And I've basically put them all in there and then use some 2-part epoxy putty to hold it all in place. And then once I've sort of done that, and also the inside ones with 2mm fibre optic, I can then, you know, once I've got that all sorted, I can then join the two halves together. Okay, and I'll just have the wires sort of coming out ready to sort of wire all up together. So it's easier at this stage to do it while the two halves are apart, and then once they're glued together I can worry about the seams and everything. So yep, that's going to be the process. So I'll get on and do the rest of them. Okay, I'm just going to quickly show you how I've set up these fibre optics with the LEDs stuck on the end of them. So just poke them out of the holes and give them a bit of a trim. So this is what they sort of look like at the moment. Pretty hideous, but they work. And so I just slide them in the hole there and do the same with the other one. So you can see they're just poking out like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give them a bit of a trim, and this is more just so that they're not sort of sticking out, causing me grief when I come to do the painting. And once I've painted them, I can cut these flush with the model. So now I've got all those in place. The next thing is to use some 2-part epoxy putty. So I'm going to be using this premium magic putty, and I'm going to basically affix these all in place and sort of feed them in. I'm going to take a toothpick and just guide the putty in. Now it doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to be functional. And all it's doing is sort of making sure that the fibre optics don't come out of the holes, and it's also holding those LEDs in place so they don't sort of break off. And I want to make sure any putty sort of goes below the top of the piece here, because these are two halves that have to go together, so you need to make sure that those two halves can still meet in the middle, no worries. And this stuff, of course, being an epoxy putty, it's rock hard. So like this one I've done previously, this feels like a rock already. That's pretty much it, I think. I will leave that to dry for a good 24 hours, and then I've got all the sort of lights in place now on both sides, so I'll be able to stick these two halves together. I think that's the extent of the lighting that I want to do for these ones. So stick the two halves together, then I can start worrying about the seams. Some progress made on the initial assembly of this kit. First of all, there's been a lot of seam cleanup. So this is the bottom part of the craft, and it's made up of two halves, and you can sort of see the seam down the centre there, which I've been cleaning up. You can sort of see that it's pretty rough there on the intake. Well, actually this is an exhaust, I believe, because this sits out the back. Now there were some moulded in fins at the back here, which when you join the two halves together, it's really quite problematic. So rather than try to line up the fins exactly, which were never going to happen, I'm going to just use some styrene sheet in there. I've also drilled a 3mm hole, so this is where the post is going to go into the base that I'll make up, and all the wiring. So there was, quite a bit of sort of seam cleanup. I had to rescribe that line over that dome sort of bit. I think after I put a coat of primer on it, I'll probably see more areas that need more work. A lot of the other components, of course, were also two halves that needed to sort of go together and needed cleanup. So like the cranes, these are all sort of two halves, so you go join together, try and match up as best you can. So this is like the foot, which unfortunately they didn't give you enough sets of these to make a version where the feet are deployed or closed. So I've chosen to do them as closed up, and then they go on pontoon arm, and they sort of stick in place there like that. But I'm going to keep these two bits separate because they're two different colours, so I'll have to do some masking there. The feet, I've had to, of course, do the seam cleanup on the top bits of the legs here before I could attach the feet. And so the feet, two halves, you can see the putty that I've used there to clean that up. And on the inside, it was going to be too hard to sort of clean up that seam there, get a sanding stick in there. So what I thought is I'd just give it a bit of texture, so at least it kind of hides the... I mean, you're never going to see it once it's sort of folded up. You're unlikely to see it at all, but I just thought that would be a better way of sort of hiding that seam in there that, well, I was never going to be able to sand properly. So I've made 4 of those guys. The actual top part I have joined together, and you can see all the wires sort of bunched under there for the LEDs. There are now a substantial amount of LEDs. I've got to join up all these lines into essentially a couple of wires, so it's going to be fun. But there was a lot of putty work. I had a bit of a major step depending on whether I tried to line up the top as best I could, but it just meant in the bottom there was a bit of a step. I'm still in the process of cleaning this up, which is kind of problematic because even these surfaces which are flat, they've actually got sort of a dip in them, so I've had to use some putty to sort of fill that out. Getting in there with a sanding stick and sanding sponges is quite tricky. This top bit here, the top deck, there is actually supposed to be a panel line along here, but again I just think it looks a bit strange, so I've decided to sort of fill it. So yeah, still quite a bit of work to do on that. And so I've got the floor of the craft here, and you can see I've drilled a couple of holes, and these holes are where the wires will feed down into the bottom part. So the wires for this front bit and also this back bit here and here, and then the wires will feed into the bottom. This will go over the top, and then the wires will come out here through the post and into the base. So I'm still trying to work out how to do, there's 2 engines that go on either side here. I'm still trying to work out how to sort of light those up as well. But essentially it'll be sort of 4 engines that lit up, and of course the windows around the sides here. So there's a fair bit of lighting in it. I think it's going to be a total of it's 10 on the top, and then there's going to be probably another 4, so 14 LEDs just in this small kit, but hopefully it'll be worth it. Okay, I've cleaned up all the seams on the main body, and I'm going to say it's a bit of a nightmare. There's all sorts of sort of intricate, nooks and crannies you have to get into. So I won't know how successful I am until I get a grey primer on it. But certainly these areas in here are quite difficult to sort of sand, and I suspect the sealing there is probably not quite right. But anyway, we'll get a grey primer on that to have a look and see how well it went. Now, moving on to the engines, what I've got here is one that I've already sort of assembled. I need to finish off these fins, but you'll get an idea of how I've actually lit this up. So if I connect the battery, and you can see what that sort of looks like. Now, it's not particularly bright at the moment. I think this battery's on the way out, but there are 2 LEDs in there. And working this out was a bit of a nightmare, because if I show you what it's actually made up of, you've essentially got sort of 2 halves of the main part of it. Now, with these fins here, it's just so hard to clean up those sort of seams. So what I ended up doing was cutting out all that area in there. You can see that I've replaced it with some 1mm thick styrene, and I'm going to sand it just so that the edges are a little bit sharper on it. Red part that goes on the other end, so that sort of sits on like that. Now, what I need to do, of course, is to drill out that center bit. So if we have a look on this one, you can see that I've sort of cut all that out, and behind it is some photo etch mesh. So this is Edward mesh 4x4. It's quite sort of fine, but I've used that sort of behind both of these engines here. Now, the top part is made up of just 2 pieces, and so I've had to drill out the center bits there, so you can sort of see there. Now, I've used some very thin styrene sheet just because it's really difficult to sand seams on the inside there. So just a bit of a trick, you know, is use a bit of styrene sheet, and that way you get a nice flat surface, so you don't have to worry about the seams so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these center bits out, and also the fins on this end, so that way you can start looking at how I've done the lighting and set up the mesh. Okay, so the first step to lighting this up is to cut out a piece of that mesh, photo etch mesh, and put it in there. And I've just used a bit of super glue. It looks a bit rough, but it's fine, just to hold it in place. Now, on the other half, I've bent over the legs of an LED. This is just a 3mm. It's like a hat type LED, but just a 3mm, and I've put a bit of paper in front of it, just thin tissue, just to kind of diffuse it a little bit. And I've just used super glue to hold all that in place as well. So you can see I've got the 2 legs sort of coming down here, and eventually what will happen is it'll feed into the larger base of the engine, and then I'll wire another LED going this way, so I'll join up the legs of the LEDs doing that. But now I need to get these 2 halves together, and it's not perfect. There is a bit of a gap, just to give you an idea what it's going to look like. So you can sort of see it's reasonably convincing, you know, with the mesh breaks it up a little bit. And instead of going all out with just a heap of glue, I'm actually going to tack it just using the Tamiya quick setting extra thin cement. And I tend to find this stuff's really good for just basically setting it up before you put a full bead of the Tamiya extra thin on there. And you'll notice I'm doing the top of it first. The reason for that is because this is the bit that's going to be seen, so I want to get this seam sort of lined up as good as possible without any sort of stepping on the top, because that's what's seen. Alright, so now that's glued in place, I'll let that dry properly and close up that seam, and then I will clean this part of the engine all up before I start on the next step. So that'll involve maybe a little bit of putting, obviously a bit of sanding, get that all ready to go, and then I can show the next step, attaching it to the larger part of the engine. Okay, I've cleaned up the seams on this top engine part. Looks a bit messy, needs a good brush down, but I won't know until I put a primer coat over it how good it looks. But the one problem is the seams on the inside here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a strip of, this is 0.25mm thick styrene sheet, so it's quite thin, and I'm going to cut a little piece and stick it in there and then sort of clamp it, and that'll help cover up that seam. Okay, so you can sort of see what I've done. It's still far from perfect, but at least those seams will sort of be covered up. So I'll let that dry, I'll trim those off and then sort of sand them all down so it looks like what I've done on this one. So you can sort of see, once that's all primed and painted, you won't even know. So you see I've ground out all this back area for the fins to go in here. So that's that piece ready to go, and of course I will grind out a slot here so that the top part so those LED legs can sort of slide on, so it'll just be a slot sort of going across. Also cleaned up this part, so taken out that middle bit and all that cleanup's done. I've hooked up all the small wires in here to two main lines here, just to make it a bit easier. I'm going to have to do the same thing here. I'm going to do it off camera, I'm sorry, it's just too fiddly to kind of join all these up, but basically what I do is I solder all the reds together, all the blacks together, and then I'll join them up with a single line, and then I'll use the epoxy putty to sort of set it in place. So that's sort of how I've done this front bit, and to sort of show you how that looks when it's hooked up to power. You sort of get the idea there. So it's come up pretty well, I think. Of course, I've got to trim down those fibre optics, but once it's all painted. Okay, you can see the mess I've made in there with the two-part epoxy putty, but everything's wired up. I've tested it all works okay. I've decided I'm going to paint this top bit first, and the floor part I'm going to paint them separately before I stick them together. I just think it's going to be easier to sort of paint things like, the inside of here. There's also a bit of masking I have to do, so I think it'll be easier if I paint all this first before I connect it. The other thing that I've done is just stuck a little bit of 0.25mm thick styrene card in there. This doorway is open, and from what I remember of the anime, that's correct. It's supposed to sort of open up into this room, but I've just put a bit of card in there to make it look like a closed door. So I think I've moved away far enough from the canon of the craft now that it doesn't sort of matter. So yeah, I've just stuck that in. So that's pretty much ready for priming. So is this piece. Now for the engine, you can sort of see a bit of a cross section of what I've done here. So if you remember, I had this top piece all done, and there were the two legs of the LEDs that sort of came down. I drilled a sort of a slot in the top of the bottom part so that those legs could fit through. And then what I've done is I've soldered another LED, so the positive lead to the positive lead of the second LED, and negative to negative. And I've cut down the legs of this second one and attached some, I believe it's called magnet wire. It's just enamelled wire, it's really thin. And the reason I've gone really thin is because I haven't worked out how I'm going to attach it to the rest of the body yet. So I thought, worst case scenario, I can drill a very small hole and pass the wires through that way. I've put this backing piece in, so this is just a bit of styrene sheet, and that's to stop any light leak coming out the back here, because there's going to be some fins going here. I really didn't want any bleed through of the LED on this side. And I'll probably end up using a bit of black fabric paint in there as well, just to fill up the gaps. In front of the LED, I've just used a bit of paper towel, and I've used super glue just to sort of hold it in place, and that's just to diffuse it a bit. It's not far from perfect, but it's yeah, just a little bit. And then finally, I've super glued in a bit of mesh, and you can see it's a little bit bent because I've tested it, and it just, yeah, I need to sort of force it into shape. So if we have a look at what that looks like once it's all together, you can sort of see that we've got the mesh there. There's this piece which goes over here like that, so that's going to cover up a multitude of sins as well. I've joined the bottom bit of the engine all up, sanded it. I also had to rescribe one of the panel lines here just because of the sanding. I lost that sort of detail, so that's all sort of, I think, as good as it's going to be until I get a primer on it and see if it'll highlight any issues. But the other thing that I've done, and it's a little bit hard to see, but I've used some fabric paint, so it'll chill it black. And this fabric paint is just put up against that back wall there, so that any light from the front here doesn't sort of leak out the back. So I don't want that. So put that in there. The next step is to take some little bits of styrene. So this is 1mm thick styrene, and I've just cut it into sort of short strips, and these are going to make the fins for the exhaust here. So the first step is to, if you have a look at the one I've already done, what I've done is I've put 3 fins in there. So I start with the middle one because that means I can work out the spacing for the other 2. Okay, so I've got that lined up. I've got it sort of jutting out a little bit, and that's fine because what I'm going to do is file it so it's flush with the outside of the exhaust, and then I can sort of scrape the edges, so give them a little bit of sharpness. So what I'm going to do now is get that glued in place. So just a little bit of, to me, extra thin. Okay, so that's in place now. I will let that dry before I do the other 2, but at least once I've got that center one in, the other 2 are easier to sort of place. So I'll get those done and clean it up so it's just like this one. And for this one, you can sort of see how the fins are sort of on the same plane as the outer edge. And the other thing I've done is just taken a knife and just sort of scraped along the edges here, just to give it a little bit of a bevel, so it's not just sort of a flat, flat bit of plastic. And I think that's come up all right. I am going to have to do that on this piece as well. So this is sort of the main, I guess, exhaust out the back of it. So I'll do the same thing with this one. I've gone ahead and primed everything in SMS grey primer, and just to sort of show you what the what these engines look like. You can see there's still a little bit of cleanup I have to do down the bottom, but it doesn't look too bad. I'm actually kind of pleased how smooth this join came up there. There's a slight sort of shadow there, but I don't think that'll be noticeable once I get colour on it, and it's also underneath, so it's not that much of an issue. There are a couple little seam issues you can see. What I'll do is I'll use some Mr. Surfacer 500, because these are really sort of shallow, and I think they're only going to need a little bit of sanding and a little bit of filling. But overall, definitely using the styrene sheet for the sort of rear exhaust, I think, is a lot better than trying to match the 2 halves and clean up all those fins. So a couple of other pieces to look at. This one, again, because they're all sort of 2 halves, you can see that shadow of a join there. Again, it's just going to be some Mr. Surfacer 500 that's going to go in there, and a little bit of light sanding. This one, the main body sort of part, was kind of interesting. It looks like I got sort of most of the join okay. A little bit in the back there you can see. But ironically, the easiest bit to sand, I messed that up. So you can sort of see there's a big shadow there. Also on the neck. The front doesn't look too bad. I had a bit of a miss with the rescribing there, but overall, again, it's just a Mr. Surfacer 500, and that'll clean up nicely. The feet have the same issue, so most of the cleanup worked pretty well, I think, but yeah, it certainly helps getting a uniform primer down to be able to see it. These converters, I think they're called, the seam worked out. Seam work on that came up all right. I don't think I'll need to do any more work on those. Also on these little stacks, the join came up pretty smooth. No sort of sign of a seam down the middle of those. And also the crane, which was pretty straightforward, but still it's worth checking. Now the other thing I haven't sort of covered yet is the figures, and like I say, these are fiddly bloody things. So each of the figures has a little sort of back piece to glue on, which is a little bit fiddly, and these do need quite a bit of cleanup. I had quite a bit of flash on mine, and where the sprues are, where they're joined to the sprues is kind of awkward, so they do take a bit of cleanup, and you get 2 each of these figures. I haven't primed those yet, but of course that's on my list of things to do. So I'm going to leave the video there. I think you get the idea. I'll do a bit of cleaning up off camera, but the next video I can start getting some colour on these pieces. So until the next video, I'll catch you later.